So just to outline before I begin that the talk covers a variety of bits of work that I'm currently working on. So the PhD, also a paper with colleagues at the Centre for Science and Security Studies, and it also draws on some field work that I conducted in Asia, Southeast Asia, on behalf of the International Centre for Security Analysis, also at King's. So just to run briefly through the overview and structure, I'm going to be broadly talking about nuclear security, the nuclear security regime, and stability, and I'm going to try as much as possible to stick to the theme of stability. And I understand that there will be some overlap with the presentation that Eben gave earlier, so at least I can try and skip through those bits quite quickly. So just to broadly outline the focus, in a world where nuclear power is becoming more desirable even after Fukushima, how do we encourage engagement with the nuclear security regime whilst allowing the desired development of nuclear energy? And this will be in specific reference to Southeast Asia, where, as I mentioned, field work was conducted late last year. So I'll shortly outline nuclear security and stability, then to provide a bit of context, the perceived threat of nuclear terrorism, and then a historical look at US-Russia, which will then frame the final discussion on Southeast Asia. So nuclear security is arguably of greater importance now than ever before, given the nuclear aspirations globally. This was evidenced in Seoul at the second Nuclear Security Summit in March of this year, attended by 53 heads of state, where President Obama, in a side address at Hankook University, stated, quote, "The international community has made it harder than ever for terrorists to acquire nuclear weapons, and that has made us all safer. We're building an international architecture that can ensure nuclear safety. But we're under no illusions. The danger of nuclear terrorism remains one of the greatest threats to global security." So he highlights an important point. Nuclear security has made us safer, and any efforts to prevent nuclear terrorism are, for the purposes of this presentation, inherently seen to be stabilizing. And from the slide, the Korean perspective on this sense of stability is nicely summarized by the strapline, "Beyond security, towards peace." So what exactly is it that we're trying to counter? And this partially has been covered by Eben earlier, but I will cover a couple of aspects slightly differently. A nuclear terrorism incident would have wide-ranging and deep-reaching implications. Kofi Annan suggested that a nuclear terrorist attack would, quote, "not only cause widespread death and destruction, but would stagger the world economy and thrust tens of millions of people into dire poverty." But it's not necessarily the number of deaths that would represent the key effect. It's the wider issues. So if we look at the map on the slide, this comes from a FEMA report released recently in the US, and it shows the impact of a nuclear device detonated by a terrorist or terrorist group at the corner of 16th and K in Washington, D.C. You can see that the kind of yellowy, light green radiation spreads far and wide. But the likely knock-on effects would then impact the economy, transport, logistics, and have numerous societal impacts too. Mikhail Gorbachev provided perhaps a more tangible warning by suggesting that, quote, "while the Chernobyl disaster was accidental, caused by faulty technology and human error, today's disaster could very well be intentional." But the threat itself is difficult to quantify, although generally classed as high risk, low probability. If it were to occur, it would take one of four forms: theft of a state nuclear weapon, construction of an improvised nuclear device, IND, sabotage of nuclear facilities or shipments, or a radiological dispersion device, an RGD or dirty bomb. And when we consider the threat, it's often linked directly to Al-Qaeda, and the diagram, not very clear, but it's the clearest version I could find, is in fact the rumoured diagram of bin Laden's implosion device, or the design. So again, as you heard from Eben earlier, Sam Nunn, the famous quote, he stated in testimony before the 9/11 Public Discourse Project, "The day after an attack, what we wish we had done, why aren't we doing it now?" So what are we doing? We have created the nuclear security regime, and this has in fact developed over time since the early 1970s in response to emerging threats with the potential to destabilise. The popularity of civilian nuclear power was paralleled by an increase in global terrorist activity, and this gave rise to concerns about terrorists acquiring radioactive materials or sabotaging nuclear sites or shipments. And this broadly mirrors the actual situation that we're in today to a certain extent. Therefore, nuclear security sets out to prevent, detect, and respond to theft, sabotage, unauthorised access, illegal transfer, or other malicious acts involving nuclear material, other radioactive substances, or their associated facilities. It's quite a broad definition. So historically, as threats have evolved, so too have responses, and this has created a pretty complex nuclear security landscape. This comprises legally binding treaties, which are often time-consuming to negotiate and require a balance between broad membership on the one hand and subject specificity on the other. But these have then been employed alongside coalition of the willing style groupings. The recent nuclear security summits, as witnessed in Seoul, were developed by the Obama administration and have raised awareness of the issues at the highest level. So why is nuclear security such a complex issue, and why does it present challenges to engagement? And these can be broken down into three main points. The first is diverging threat perceptions. The threat, as I mentioned, is relatively abstract. It's difficult to quantify. There's no historical precedent. And it's also seen as an issue for states possessing nuclear weapons or materials. Abroad in nuclear politics, there is a tension between nuclear powers who are deemed to be raising the requirements to gain access to nuclear technology and the aspiring nuclear states who feel shortchanged by a lack of progress on disarmament pledges by the nuclear weapon states. Similarly, national responsibility. Activity in the arena is based at the national level in order to try and distance the issue, nuclear security, from broader NPT politics, which obviously are complicated by the aforementioned tensions. So consensus doesn't have to preclude action, is the idea. And the result is a very complex and patchwork nuclear security landscape. A number of instruments have evolved to try and plug the gaps in the existing regime, and these take the form of informal as well as formal regulations. So informally, we have the Information Circular 225, which was initially released in its first edition in 1975 by the IEA and forms a guidance document on the physical protection of nuclear material. In terms of formal regulation, the Convention on the Physical Protection of Nuclear Material was open for signature in 1980. So there's this mixture of legalistic as well as coalition of the willing style agreements. And then finally, the role of the UN and the IEA. States generally are more comfortable engaging with the UN process where they can stake a claim, rather than external coalitions that may be seen to trying to impose or dictate rules upon them. Similarly, the IEA doesn't have any teeth in the field of nuclear security. There's no verification mechanism, and it's pretty difficult to assess implementation. Similarly, the IEA has no legal authority. States must request assistance or guidance, and any security concerns spotted by inspectors in the field cannot be reported back to the Office of Nuclear Security, for example. So then just to briefly look at a historical example of where nuclear security has had an impact, and I'm very aware that we've possibly touched on certain issues earlier in the day, so again, I'll try and be brief on this section. Following the fall of the Berlin Wall and the political turmoil that ensued, the security of nuclear materials and facilities distributed across the former Soviet Union was questionable. It was commonly acknowledged that the commonly acknowledged threat that material could be obtained by malicious actors. And this led to non-Lugar legislation passed in the US in 1992. This paved the way for cooperative threat reduction, the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, or CTR. Within this, it had a mandate to, quote, secure and dismantle weapons of mass destruction and their associated infrastructure in former Soviet Union states. And I argue that this program has had a broadly stabilizing effect on US-Russia. And I also thought it would be an interesting fact that kind of demonstrates the effectiveness of nuclear security efforts. That the HEU purchase agreement between the US and Russia actually means that 1 in 10 American light bulbs is now powered by material that was once part of a Russian nuclear weapon pointed at the US. Obviously, certain conditions were present within this case study. The threat was pretty explicit and easily recognizable. Both countries had nuclear industries and vast weapons complexes, which created a greater sense of mutual understanding of the threat. And this is useful to bear in mind when I come on to the Southeast Asian example in a second. Also, it's important to note that CTR created momentum and played an important role in follow-on initiatives such as the Global Partnership, which continues work in this area, but attempting to become more multilateral. So if we shift the focus to Southeast Asia, which is a region of the world that hasn't really had much coverage today, we're confronted with a new set of challenges. And I realise that Southeast Asia is far removed from a rainy day in London. But just to set the scene, I was part of a team that conducted interviews in 4 countries in December of last year, in which we spoke with a range of members of government, academia, and civil society about nuclear security in Southeast Asia. We felt it was an important region, given the take-up of nuclear power and the proposed plans for nuclear power in the region, and again, it was relatively underexplored. So the region itself is estimated to produce 2 gigawatts electrical using nuclear technology by 2020. Indonesia intends to generate 4% of domestic electricity using nuclear power by 2025. Malaysia looks to have put nuclear plans on hold for the time being, although interviews suggested that it's more of an inevitability and would probably occur sometime in the future, especially if Indonesia does go ahead. Similarly, Vietnam is the most developed in the nuclear sense, is in the early stages of developing a nuclear program and plans to have a nuclear power plant online by 2020. It plans a total of 7 nuclear power plants with 14 reactors. And all of this in spite of the events of Fukushima. But given numerous other pressing security concerns, nuclear terrorism is not currently a priority for regional actors. Regional interest in nuclear security is therefore limited. However, the nuclear security regime must be truly international to be effective in preventing an act of nuclear terrorism. So it's apparent that there's huge ambition in the region, but with this come a number of challenges. So how does the global community support such growth whilst minimising any threats to stability? The nuclear security regime is only strong as its weakest link. So how do we reduce the vulnerabilities? Well, first, we need to identify the weaknesses. There's an almost non-existent threat perception of nuclear terrorism in Southeast Asia. The region lacks domestic terrorist threats, in addition to nuclear material and nuclear infrastructures. And also would argue that it has adopted necessary national legislation to counter any threats that it may perceive. The threat of Indonesian terrorist group Jemaah Islamiyah, for example, is overplayed, and we were told as much when we were in the region. So nuclear security is not a priority because nuclear terrorism is not seen as a threat. But this lack of perceived threat is obviously very different to the US-Russian case. But the nuclear security regime is seen as an obstacle, in fact, to realising the nuclear objectives that I mentioned on the previous slide. And this was a particularly prevalent theme throughout interviews in the region. It was argued that increased legislation raises the barriers to entry, and the threat of technology lockout was pretty grave if non-compliant. So countries are signing up to certain nuclear security instruments, but it seems to be a begrudging necessity. And this was, I think, demonstrated in Seoul at the Security Summit. Indonesian representatives committed to ratify the International Convention on the Suppression of Acts of Nuclear Terrorism, ICSANT. Malaysia will ratify the amended Convention on the Physical Protection of Nuclear Material and ICSANT. And the Vietnamese government will also ratify the amended CPPNM. But it's important at this stage to highlight the difference between high-level commitments on the one hand and actual implementation on the ground. And it seems to me there's a massive disconnect between the two. There are also debates regarding the grand bargain. And this is, I think I've alluded to this, but there's a feeling that the non-nuclear weapon states are having to sign up to more despite the perceived limited efforts of nuclear weapon states regarding disarmament pledges. And just finally, with regard to the challenges, the porous borders present a particular area of concern. And this, I think, was exemplified by the illicit proliferation network of AQ Khan, who employed front companies in Malaysia and used Malaysia and Singapore as transshipment hubs. So if nuclear security is critical to global stability, and if we want to move beyond security towards peace, nuclear security needs to be more accessible, affordable, and worthwhile, and also easily incorporated into domestic agendas of Southeast Asian states. So I've tentatively suggested some ways forward, the first of which is repackaging of instruments and initiatives that are aimed at nuclear security but also have this dual use. And customs and border security could be one potential area to explore. Malaysia, for example, realises that export controls are a primary concern in light of the AQ Khan network, and this is an area that they'd be more prepared to work on than something explicitly related to nuclear security. Similarly, directed technical assistance for those states developing nuclear power programs can also be used to try and implement a more robust and sustainable security culture. In terms of specific but shared areas of concern, another positive development to come out of Seoul was the success of so-called gift baskets. And in addition to house gifts, which are examples of national progress and commitments to nuclear security efforts, these gift baskets allowed the grouping of like-minded states committing to action in specific areas. This initiative would allow groups of states to move beyond the limitations of global consensus and focus on particular areas of concern. This could be in the form of a regional engagement or indeed wider bilateral or multilateral relationships beyond Southeast Asia. Foreign policy force multipliers. In terms of regional organisations, some have suggested trying to use the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, as a conduit to enhance regional activity in this field and give Southeast Asia a greater presence internationally. But this was seen as improbable by most analysts in the region. It's primarily focused on economics. And then, yeah, no problem. To include sensitive issues such as nuclear energy and national security would be pushing the organisation's remit too far. I can cover nuclear summitry probably in more detail in Q&A, although I've touched on it briefly throughout. I just want to talk very briefly about the US and China, especially China, which I haven't really touched on yet, but it's developing a regional centre of excellence and providing nuclear security training, but I argue that China could adopt a more overt role in the region, given its numerous political and economic links into Southeast Asia, and it can try and demonstrate that in fact, nuclear security is not designed to try and constrain any access to nuclear energy. So finally, just to conclude, threat of nuclear terrorism will always exist as long as nuclear material is in existence, and this will be despite enhanced nuclear security efforts, but such efforts minimise the risk of any of these threats ever being realised. The regime suffers weaknesses and will continue to do so, but recognising them and overcoming the challenges will define the regime's future, as it has done historically. And finally, that the nuclear security regime has played an important role in US-Russia relations and can have a similar effect elsewhere, thereby strengthening broader stability. The situations are clearly different, but bilateral and multilateral nuclear security efforts can strengthen stability more broadly.